Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, or whatever is appropriate for your time zone. Thank you for joining the mAgri webinar today. My name is Amol Jadhav. I'm a project manager for the GSMA mAgri program. And today I'm broadcasting to you from New Delhi, along with a few mAgri colleagues. I'm also very excited to have a panel of experts joining us soon on the webinar, all of which are from around the world. Today, our topic is focused on female smallholder farmers and specifically some approaches to designing and marketing information and advisory services to those female smallholders. This is our first knowledge sharing event focused on gender, so our objective here is to really introduce the gender themes to our mAgri community. In future gender-focused knowledge sharing activities, we'll jump into more detailed themes. It's also great to see that over 100 folks or so have registered for the webinar today, and I see about 60, almost 60 or so are on the webinar with us right now. About 60% of those who registered said they are currently implementing or are about to implement a strategy for reaching women farmers with their agricultural service, and 14% said they're not developing a gender strategy now because they just don't know how. So we hope that both of those audiences find our discussion today valuable and interesting. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Firstly, to those of you who are tweeting today, our suggested hashtag is #mAgri or #mAgri, and you can follow the GSMA mAgri team at GSMA Agri. I'm sorry, at GSMA mAgri. That's our Twitter handle. Second item, Q&A will be at the end. So as we go through the presentation, as questions pop up in your head, please type your questions in the question box in the control panel on the right side of your screen, and we'll try to address as many as possible given the time constraint. If we can't get to your question, we'll try to address it by email following up after the webinar. Last but not least, please keep your line on mute at all times. We have too many people on the line to have open discussions. Next slide, please. So here's a quick look at our agenda today. We thought we'd start off with a discussion on why we should be targeting women, the commercial and social reasons to do so. Next, we have highlights from research conducted by our mWomen program at the GSM Association, who we work closely with. Finally, our last two items are the meat of the webinar. I hope there aren't many vegetarians. Here we'll be giving some insights and examples of how to design and market agricultural services to women smallholders. Next slide, please. Now, I'm very excited to be joined by this panel of agricultural and gender experts. Firstly, there's Haven Lai. She's a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She'll be sharing some reasons, some social reasons why we should be targeting women farmers. Per Helmersen is my colleague from the GSMA mWomen program, where he's a research manager. He'll be sharing some highlights from the GSMA BOP and Women study. Next is Sophia Huyer. She's the executive director of WISAT, Women in Global Science and Technology. Lastly, but not leastly, is Jemima Njuki. Jemima is the global team lead for women in Agriculture, the Pathways program at CARE. Special thanks to all those joining us and taking time to contribute to the webinar and to participate in the webinar. It's been a challenge logistically as we've been spread across time zones, so special thanks for them to participate today. So the first item on the agenda is about why targeting women, the commercial reasons and examples. That will be covered by me. Again, my name is Amol Jadhav. I'm the mAgri project manager with the GSMA Development Fund. Next slide, please. So if we look at this chart and diagram, these represent the mobile phone gender gap and what that equates to in dollars. You can clearly see that MNOs around the world are missing a $13 billion market opportunity by not catering to or not successfully incorporating women in their customer base. We can also see that most of this opportunity comes from the emerging and developing markets like Latin America, Africa, Middle East, South, and East Asia. These regions, these 4 or 5 regions alone count for over 80% of that missed market opportunity, over $8 billion. So we can see that, yeah, a majority of this, this market opportunity comes from people on the webinar today who are listening in from these regions. Next slide, please. The next commercial reason why you should be targeting women is because they compose the largest segment of your labor force. When developing any product or marketing any product, one needs to identify the target market and tailor products to them. That's just standard practice, regardless of what product or service you're creating. In the case of most African and South Asian markets, we see the largest market segment of the labor force to be women farmers. Let's look at these 2 examples, one from East and West Africa. In Nigeria, for example, if you look at the labor force, that's the inside circle, 30% is non-agriculture, 20% is the male agricultural workforce, and 40% of the entire country of Nigerian workforce are women farmers. In Kenya, it's even more slanted towards female farmers. 64% of their workforce is composed of female farmers. So any network operator that wants to have subscribers, they shouldn't be overlooking the largest segments of their markets. Next slide. Here we see 2 commercial examples of services which have been tailored to women. The first is the Community Knowledge Worker Program in Uganda. This is a tie-up between the Garmin Foundation App Labs and MTN Uganda. A community knowledge worker is essentially a trusted member of the community who is equipped with a smartphone to access agriculture and other valuable information for their community members. Each community knowledge worker covers about 4 to 6 villages, 500 to 800 households in a 5 to 10 kilometer radius. And what they have found is that by having female community knowledge workers, they were able to better serve and connect with the female community members. Later on in the presentation, we'll be jumping into a bit more detail on the Community Knowledge Worker Program and how they're incorporating women. Our second example comes from Pakistan, where MobileLink and UNESCO teamed up to use SMS messages to improve young women's literacy. The success of this program demonstrates how mobile phones can be used to increase the reach and effectiveness of basic education programs. It also illustrated the fact that suspicion of mobile phones can be overcome by showing parents and leaders how mobiles can be used to transmit culturally sensitive information while increasing girls' sense of security. Next slide, please. I now want to give the floor to Haven Lay. Haven is a Senior Program Officer on the Agricultural Development Team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. There, she manages a portfolio of investments targeted at 2 objectives. Firstly, to influence the agricultural R&D agenda to reflect the specific needs of 4 women farmers. And secondly, developing and testing models that increase women farmers' access to productive agricultural resources. Thank you for joining us, Haven, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Amol. I appreciate it. And good morning to all of you. It's 6 a.m. on the west coast here of the United States, and it's a beautiful morning, so I hope that all of your days are going very well. Next slide, please. I'm just going to do a very quick background on the foundation because it nicely sets up our interest in agricultural development and why it is that we care about women farmers in our ag development program. Some of you may know, and I believe that there are some grantees even on the phone, and GSMA is one as well, that the Ag Development Program of the Foundation is our 2nd largest program behind our large global health investments. And in ag development, our main objective is to reduce poverty. And we support ag development since the majority of poor living in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. It just makes economic sense to target agriculture if you care about the poor in the developing world. Since 2007, we've invested about $1.5 billion or so, working with about 180 grantees who are implementing solutions to support poor smallholder farmers and their families, again, in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And our approach is really to invest up and down the molecule-to-mouth, so-called value chain, with about half of our investments developing new technologies that have the potential to improve yields and do things like adapt to climatic stresses, lower labor costs and exertion, etc. The remaining of our investment is spent on the policy and data environment and on ensuring that any resulting productivity gains can be directly linked to local and regional markets, i.e. can be realized by poor farmers and used. As Norman Borlaug once said famously, you can't eat potential, and that's true. It's worth noting that for us, increasing productivity for poor smallholders means ensuring that these farmers are empowered and knowledgeable to adopt new technologies, implement best practices, and influence and use the market to their advantage. And that means the overwhelming majority of our grants and grantees use some mechanism or modality of extension, and many of them use ICT-enabled service delivery or information sharing mechanisms. So we have some information coming directly from grantees about what is best up-to-date extension information. Now, since the very beginning, we've had an explicit focus on the gender of our core clients, and as Amol nicely laid out, we know empirically that in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, about half or more than half of the farmers that we're serving are women. And these numbers actually appear to be increasing with increasing male out-migration to urban centers where males go seek wage employment and leave oftentimes women and their families on the farm. And we also know empirically, and we experience it anecdotally every day, that women farmers in our target areas are constrained from optimal productivity gains because they really lack the access to and control over ag resources that are required to raise production. And these obviously include things like having secure land over time, having available access to credit when and where they need it, having labor available when and where they need it is a very important constraint that women farmers face. In many cases, that women lack up-to-date knowledge. Knowledge does not trickle through a village or a household unmitigated. And this is an inefficiency that we aim to tackle through our grant making. And here you'll see on the slide the cover shot of one of our guidance documents. Sorry, just to go back on that slide a moment. The cover slide of one of our documents that we do to inform grantees of our expectations that they strive to design programs that meet the needs of both women and men, and ensuring grants are designed effectively to reach and benefit both of them. So forward slide, please. So Amol laid out some bottom line reasons for why investing in women or, quote, targeting women might be a good thing for businesses or the corporate sector. Many more of you on the phone or on the webinar, I believe, are interested in achieving social outcomes. Many of you probably work in poverty reduction or achieving food security. And indeed, when you think about investing in women, it's oftentimes social outcomes, which are the things that are top to mind. So here I just carved out a few, not all certainly, of the social outcomes or objectives that the empirical and literature research does support that investing in women can help and be a catalytic force in achieving these outcomes. I've just mentioned that our overall objective at the foundation is achieving poverty reduction through ag development. And indeed, we feel if we don't target women, because of the majority of workers and clients within our target workforce, and improving their productivity will have negligible results on poverty reduction in households. And I should just note that there's a note of caution, however, that simply increasing women's yields does not have a linear relationship between household income and certain measures of poverty reduction. For instance, there could be trade-offs at the household level which might negate poverty impacts. For instance, if women's labor increases unsustainably or to the detriment of household economy or her welfare, or her children's welfare. On nutrition, we know that we're much more likely to have a positive impact on childhood nutrition if women earn and, importantly, can control the expenditure of a marginal dollar of her own income, potentially from sales of her surplus agriculture. Women's income is more positively correlated with nutritional improvements than is men's income, and that's kind of widely held in studies or from around the world. So if you really care about intra-household expenditures, if you care about increasing childhood nutrition, boosting a woman's income and ensuring that she can control and spend it how she likes is a smart way to go. And for the foundation, we're in this kind of for the long haul. We're in this to change the mechanisms that enable the poverty trap. So if you want to achieve lasting and sustained social benefits, intergenerational ones, women's incomes tend to have a larger impact on things like childhood education, care, and well-being than that on their fathers. And if you believe that primary, secondary education is a catalyst to break the poverty trap, and many empirical studies do suggest just that investing in women and boosting their incomes and building their empowerment so they can actually control expenditures may be a very, very good place to start. And that's what we do as well. And I'll just make a note of caution on that last final social outcome is that there's a lot of over-speculation about why women put their dollar behind child care and care practices and nutrition and education. And I think there's no evidence to suggest that that's their preference. And so a lot more evidence and research is needed to why that is the case. And perhaps we'll hear from her a little bit about that in the future. Next slide, please. And just very quickly, in the interest of time, I'll just touch upon one example that might be germane to this discussion this morning. We fund, well over 150 gender-responsive grants, but just to take one, Farm Radio International is a project based out of the University of Guelph in Canada, and the major aim of the project is to design and implement a participatory, multi-stakeholder action research program to discover and disseminate best practices for using radio-based communications to enhance food security and reduce poverty in Africa. And their overall goal is to use radio to deliver messages that improve farmer practices and boost yields. And they've implemented a really sophisticated and really interesting gender strategy that some of the lessons might be very applicable to designing other market survey instruments, such as they've really got the content catered to women's specific tasks on farm. They're really boosting women's listenership by obviously targeting what matters to women, not surprisingly. So they focus a lot in some cases on crop storage and harvesting and processing. They found that the time of day when they broadcast is important if they want to get more women listeners, and they've really targeted a lot of the things about women's own lives for the time of day when women is in the household, taking care of children and often cooking. They've found and done great testing on this that the lead-in voice, often a man's, can often make women not listen to the radio as closely, and so they've taken a lot of new women presenters and found that women respond to women's voices over the radio much more dramatically. They also found even the way in which the segment is written, if it's written in a more dramatic way, what the Western audience might think of as kind of a soap opera fashion, women tend to really respond to it and talk about it afterwards. So the dramatic nature of couching some of these messages seems to have an impact with women in a way that it doesn't with men. And importantly, and this is also true with mobile phone-enabled technologies, they notice that the radio is often a mobile asset owned by one person in the household. So understanding how that asset is shared in the household and where it moves during the day, it often goes out to the field or goes up the road or away from the household, depending on who owns it, is important to understand how they're going to get that information translated. Next slide, please. And just finally, I mean, we're talking a little bit about targeting women, but I think a lot of people on the webinar note that targeting women is kind of an easy way to say we need to be thinking about both men and women in the household. There's very little evidence to suggest that, quote, targeting women in a vacuum without bringing her household or her community along will have positive or even sustainable changes in her behavior or household's behavior. And I just note this table to say that it is a household economy in most cases. If it's not a male in the household, it's often a mother-in-law or her children or an extended family member. So when we think about targeting women, we should also be thinking about designing services that are responsive to both women and men, and that should be the outcome that we perhaps be seeking, especially where an asset like a mobile phone or a radio is a shared asset. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Haven. I appreciate those insights. Our next panel speaker is my colleague from the GSMA and Women program. Helmersen is the research manager for the GSMA Development Fund and Women program. In this role, he is responsible for identifying knowledge gaps, initiating and coordinating research focusing on the needs of understanding women and existing and proposed mobile solutions addressing those needs. Thanks for joining us, Per. I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks a lot, Amol. Am I on? Can you hear me, everyone?
Yes, we can, Per.
Great. I've had some sound problems. I just wanted to make sure. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, evening, and so on and so forth. I'm joining you from Oslo, Norway today. So this is, I guess, the third continent on this call. I'm going to try to run very quickly through some relevant research findings, or at least I hope they'll be relevant, from a project supported by USAID and USAID that the GSMA and Women program carried out last year. On the last and final slide of the presentation, you'll find some links to the research reports and the research tools as well on our website. You're free to look at them, download them, and so on. But my presentation today will be based on these findings with some additional supporting evidence also from some previous research that I've done in Malawi and Pakistan. And as I said, I'll try to focus on findings that are relevant for women in agriculture, but I've really not pulled out a separate subsample of women smallholders. I'm assuming then that our research findings will include quite a few of them, either, well, at some point in the agricultural value chain, either as producers or processors or even retailers of agricultural products. Next slide, please. This was typical what we call voice of the consumer research, and by that I mean we primarily tried, or at least initially tried, to allow women to inform us about their aspirations, their values, their life priorities, life goals, their needs, and especially their barriers and pain points in their lives. So initially we did not really want to look at this through the lens of the mobile phone. Often this is the case, as I'm sure you're all aware, in traditional telecom market research. Everything is framed within mobile communication. We eventually did this as well, but our first objective was to let women talk freely and openly about their lives and their needs. We looked at a sample of 2,500 women living on $2 to $3 a day, adjusted for purchasing power parity, between the ages of 18 and 64. In 4 different markets: Papua New Guinea, Egypt, Uganda, and in India. In India, we split the country up into 4 separate regions because India is a very complex, multifaceted culture, and we wanted to try to capture as much of this as possible. In addition to the surveys we did, we also carried out qualitative studies, and this was probably the biggest component in terms of time consumption. We did day in the life of research, day in the life of interviews. We did focus group discussions, in-depth interviews, and so on. We also did some interviews with male focus groups to sort of frame all of this. We wanted to get some sense of what men were thinking, saying, and so on. I think this links very well with what Haven just said. We need to understand the totality and the context in order to propose anything relating to women and their empowerment. Next slide, please. So we wanted basically to know what their priorities were in life. These are probably the 4 which top the list. Certainly they wanted a good education for their children, and their children were their main priority in life. This applies across all of the markets we studied. It applies equally in urban and rural areas. Children were their top priority, securing a good education and a good future for their children. This also applies to health care. When they wanted improved health care, it was mainly for their children. They had certain needs as well as women, which were not being fulfilled by the healthcare system, but the health of their children was their main priority. The third priority that is relevant here is being a good wife. And being a good wife, of course, varies from culture to culture. What that is, it generally includes caring for children and being an obedient daughter-in-law in most cultures. But it also includes being a productive smallholder farmer and caring for the, especially in a culture like Papua New Guinea, caring for the small garden plots that they had was extremely important. That was part of the role of the woman. And this was actually where most of the family's fruit and vegetables were being produced, and sometimes a small revenue was also generated from these small garden plots. Finally, and this is probably the starting point for future research that we're going to be doing, many women said that they wanted to save their own money. This was a big issue for all of them and ranked number 1 out of 40 attitudinal statements in both Uganda and Papua New Guinea. And we'll get back to that shortly. Next slide, please. Yeah, I'll just cover this very shortly. We asked them about their aspirations for their children, how these aspirations ranked. And you'll notice that in 7th position, being a farmer was one of the aspirations they had for their children. So not really a big priority. Most of the women would prefer to see their children educated in some job, preferably in an urban area. Marrying well, being a businesswoman or a businessman, and so on. I think this also says something about farmers and what aspirations they have for their children. Next slide, please. Okay, these are some of the barriers these women reported. Cultural barriers, of course, are important, especially limiting access to education. Again, for their children, not as much for themselves, but for their children. Access to information, we've touched on that, and this includes also farming information, information about seeds, crop production, fertilizers, plant diseases, and so on. I think Jemima will have a lot more to say about this. Personal security was also a big issue, especially in places like Papua New Guinea, where transportation to market was a big issue for women. They had problems actually bringing their produce safely to market without encountering security issues. Limited mobility, both for financial and cultural reasons, was a big issue. And finally, last but not least, access to formal financial instruments to expand their entrepreneurial activities or their farming. Next slide, please. One of the things that really struck me, this is across all markets, again, urban as well as rural, is how sophisticated these women were as financial managers in their families. Even though they lacked access to these financial instruments, there was a wide range of other financial instruments like chit funds, which it's a form of lottery, money guards, local money lenders, loans from family, neighbors, and friends. In India, especially southern India, savings in gold, either gold coins or gold jewelry, was very popular. And this gold jewelry could then be cashed in at pawn shops if you needed some extra money for emergencies. And the hidden stash. And the hidden stash is sort of the version of the cookie jar. It varies from pinning bills to the inside of your sari to hiding things in various locations inside of your home. So these women sort of juggled their finances using all of these instruments. And the reason was obvious. They didn't have any other formal instruments to serve their needs. Next slide, please. This is one example that I found in Malawi, actually. And you look at the poster here. This is a government campaign. Moneylenders are usually the only source of short-term credit for women farmers and women entrepreneurs in villages. Often the repayment terms are negotiable, meaning that if they can't meet the down payment, they can pay using their bodies, more or less. And this was something that the government was targeting, especially due to AIDS and the spread of various venereal diseases. Next slide, please. This is another example from Pakistan, from a rural area in northern Pakistan. This young man here is specialized in paying bills. So women who do not have access to banks because it's too far to travel, their male family members will not allow them to travel to banks, they give this guy their utility bills. So there's gas, electricity, and water bills in front of them. And 90% of those bills, he told us, are from women who are not allowed to go to banks to pay their bills. So he charges a small commission and pays their bills for them. Next slide, please. So these are some of the self-reported barriers we have from the Global Findex database relating to financial service. Distance is a big issue, the lack of branch offices, ATMs, and so on locally. And this is for those who actually do have bank accounts, very few of them. The cost of accessing your funds. There are usually withdrawal charges associated with that, and that was a big barrier. Lack of documentation is something we take for granted, who have driver's licenses and so on. That's a big problem in many emerging economies. They do not have approved documentation. Okay, I'm running a bit behind, so I'm going to jump very quickly to the next slide. How do you reach them? We have something called the mobile phone internet gender gap. So the first inclination will be, well, let's try to make some internet services for them. Remember then that only 2% of BOP women in our survey have actually used the mobile internet. But there's great potential because many, 23%, are interested in using it. The role of TV and radio, I might also add, has been mentioned already. Great opportunities here. And I think the role of women's groups should also be emphasized. These are groups organized either by religious organizations or self-help groups and so on who can provide valuable assistance in targeting and reaching women with information. Next slide, please. And finally, if you do choose to go down the road of technology, I think this is something you should be aware of, the power gap. Remember that 38% of BOP women actually live off-grid. So charging their mobile phones is often a big problem, not to mention running their TV sets and radios. The SMS utility gap, we referred to it as, women are not generally in favor of using SMS. They prefer voice. So that's another thing to keep in mind. There are various reasons for this. Perhaps the services so far available have not been useful enough. So the practical value is something you'll look at. And finally, there are technical literacy barriers, which I think others will address. Thank you.
Thank you, Per, for participating today. Don't worry, the links on the previous slide, we will send out an email afterwards and follow up. So yeah, other resources or links shared today, we'll be sure to send it out. Next on our agenda, Sophia Huyer, the Executive Director of WISAT. And give me 1 second. Thank you for joining us, Sophia. Yeah, the Executive Director of WISAT. I'll let you take it from here, Sophia.
Thanks, Amol, and thanks to everyone. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this. I'm speaking to you from Canada, on the east coast of Canada, so it's not quite as early for me this morning. WISAT, for those of you who can't read it, stands for Women in Global Science and Technology. I'm here to talk about designing projects and services for women smallholders. I'll be speaking primarily from the development point of view, but I think there's a lot that can be applied to developing services to reach women smallholders using mobiles. First slide, please. I'll be talking about two main entry points and aspects of doing this. One is what are the key issues to keep in mind and which turn into entry points for integrating gender into mobile agricultural projects. And the second set of slides will be looking at what can be done, what are the steps to take. Next slide, please. There are two main categories, two main kind of groups of issues to keep in mind when setting up a gender-focused, gender-targeted ICT and agricultural project. One has to do with what we've heard a lot about so far this morning, about the gender differences and inequalities in agriculture, which include women's lower level of access to productive resources, their mobility and time constraints considering their family responsibilities, as well as their lack of access to income and formal credit and financing, as Per has just told us. The second group of issues to keep in mind and to focus on are to improve women's access to agricultural services and agribusiness. So that involves women's need for information on market prices, their need for services, their need to coordinate with other actors in the value chain, a need for transparency in governance, business registration, and land administration, which I won't go into in detail here, the pressing need for the collection and use of sex disaggregated data, not only on agriculture, but also on women's use of ICTs, and, as we know, control over income and access to financing. Next slide, please. So the first step to take in setting up a service for women is undertaking the gender analysis. This needs to be done for every project. You need to understand what are men's and women's different roles in the value chain, what is their different access to resources, what services are required to support these roles. It's also very important to consult with women and men separately and to make sure that women have a chance to voice their views. At some points that may require having separate individual interviews with women away from family members or away from husbands or fathers because they may feel uncomfortable voicing their opinion. In other respects, in other situations that may not be appropriate, but these things need to be carefully taken into account. The other kinds of issues to keep in mind are what kind of access do women and men have to ICTs and mobiles, and often it will be quite different. So questions around access or ownership. Do women have access to a phone, or do they have control over the phone? Is it a pay-as-you-go or a subscription? How many SIM cards are being used? And is the preferred form of information text or voice? Next slide, please. Oh, and as an example, ICTs that reduce the need to travel to speak with suppliers, buyers, or transporters will help overcome time and mobility, and this will reduce travel time. So that's one example of how you can look at the use of ICTs in terms of, or mobiles, in terms of what are the needs for women. An example is the Zambia National Farmer Organization, which has implemented an SMS-based information service. This is nationwide, and both male and female farmers are using it. I'm using here a quote from a woman farmer who found that the value of this service for her was that not only could she identify the best pricing for her products, but she could now, in a much better way, coordinate delivery and pickup with other producers and clients to save her both time and money. And also she called attention to the fact that the less traveling which involved for her is a security issue, so that she felt that some of the risk involved in traveling to the urban area was reduced for her. Second example is the Bangladeshi women chicken farmers, who were able to gain new leverage with a local trader by arranging to phone him whenever they had 50 chickens for sale. Earlier, they had just gone to him with smaller numbers of chickens and as a result had received lower prices for them. So this not only increased the volume that they could sell, but it allowed them to increase their prices by 60%, enabling them to aggregate chickens from a larger group of producers. This actually increased production of chickens, increased prices, and has made this a much more successful enterprise in the village, as backyard chickens are now considered a profitable enterprise. Next slide, please. The second step to take is to look at appropriate content which will meet the needs of women and men farmers. And this involves two aspects. First of all, non-text-based approaches are very important. So the type of content, the format of the content is very important, and Per has already remarked on that. Women around the world tend to have lower levels of literacy. They also tend to have less experience with the non-local languages such as English or Spanish or French. Now this is not as true for younger women, since literacy levels among young women are increasing enormously, but this is still true for many women farmers in the developing world. So examples of how to address this issue are seen in Kenya and India, where KenCall developed the Kenya Farmer Helpline called mKilimo, which is an interactive alternative to text delivery, so that instead of receiving messages via SMS, farmers can actually call up the helpline and talk to a real person, in quotes, for information on land preparation, planting, pest management, marketing, etc. They can also speak in a range of language. English, Swahili, and other local languages are supported by the helpline. In this example, in the first 18 months, 25,000 farmers were reached, and approximately 43% of the callers were women. So that's a successful approach. The Agri Helpline in India also provides information, inputs, and services in real time through mobiles. It provides a green SIM card, which delivers 5 free voice messages daily on different topics, and it also provides an interactive helpline. An analysis of the users of this service have found that women are listeners of the daily messages, but only 13% of the direct users, in that the majority of SIM owners are men. So in this project, women can benefit from the messages that are sent via the voicemail messages that are sent to them, but their husbands are the ones who are in control of the service. The project undertook some steps on some studies on how to target women farmers more directly, and once they had completed some of those studies, they started targeting certain kinds of information as being important to women and delivered those through voice messaging. So they tried to reach women directly that way. They are also running a successful partnership with a women's self-help group in Tamil Nadu, delivering customized information to the groups after discussion and development with the groups. And finally, the Self-Employed Women's Association in India is a large union for women employed in the non-formal sector. They provide current and future commodity prices to their members to help them decide on when and where to sell the produce. They're experimenting with a range of technologies. Members who own or have access to mobile phones can receive their messages, text messages directly, but those without phones can use a computer-based notice board that's posted in the village. SEWA is experimenting with an interactive voice response system for illiterate members and also the speech recognition software. So far, over 20,000 women are using this system. Next slide, please. This next two steps are very closely connected, and that's looking at how the mobile can be connected into either existing information networks or connected up with a range of different technologies to ensure that the most women are reached. Because we do know that women tend to use more informal networks for information more so than men do. They tend to use their social and family networks. So how do you tap into that? Well, the women, radio, for example, as Haven had mentioned earlier, is an extremely effective format for reaching not only women farmers, but male farmers as well, because the infrastructure is there. The radio is very affordable and can be owned by a community, and farmers can do other tasks while they're listening to the radio. Women of Uganda Network has been working in this area for a while. Their project on enhancing access to agricultural information uses mobile phones, radio cassettes, and community radio. As a result of connecting up these three technologies, ICT usage has increased, but also they're finding that the rural women farmers are understanding how they can use ICT more broadly for a range of information and services, including access to market information, contacting extension workers, and participating in community radio shows, which are often a very important way for women to raise issues of importance to them in the community. Dimitra FAO is supporting community listening clubs in Niger, where women call in questions and comments with their mobile phones when they cannot reach a radio station, and the answers are then broadcast over the airwaves. In support of this, Dimitra has delivered 304 solar and wind-up radios in different communities in Niger and 100 solar-charged mobiles, and that's a very effective program at this point. And next slide, please. And the last two sections involve the use of and kind of outputs of the use or results of the use of technologies with women in agricultural projects. It's very important to identify employment opportunities for women as well as men with agriculture-related ICT services and with service providers, which will help maintain the sustainability of the project and which will, of course, help to address one of women's key needs of the need for increased income and financial resources. Kilimo has been doing some interesting things with this again, where employment opportunities in the project include work as call center consultants and operators, for example, in providing agricultural information on the helpline to farmers. This kind of activity can be an excellent option for female extension agents who often find it difficult to travel to remote districts in the country, or who may be restricted from interacting with male farmer groups. So this can be a very good option for income for them. Women can also be trained to act as information intermediaries or community knowledge workers, liaising between community and the agricultural information providers. This is an excellent strategy because not only do they gain skills and earn income, but this can bring knowledge into parts of the village or community where it might not have been effectively reached before, as they disseminate the knowledge through their informal networks. And it also ensures that women's information interests and needs and perspectives are included in the content of the service delivery. An example in India is a project by Vidyal and the Commonwealth of Learning, which trained women to develop audio content for the mobile phone based on, in this case, animal care and livestock management. The materials were developed in consultation with the Tamil Nadu Veterinary and Animal Sciences University and contextualized using local culture and dialects. The learning materials provide short, concise audio messages which run about 60 seconds, and 3 to 5 of those are sent to participating farmers every day. As well, the FAQ system is linked to universities, research institutions, and extension organizations for more complicated information. And finally, the last point I'd like to make is to collect disaggregated data at every step of the service design at the beginning to assess your needs, on an ongoing basis to understand who's benefiting and who's using and what kind of information is most effective, and at the end of the day to assess how many women participated in a real way, how many women had active use and interaction with the information, who were owners and users of information. And as well, tracking this carefully can actually provide a basis for people who don't have the credit documentation, who don't have the credit history. If they can provide a history of their use of information systems, services, agricultural services, of their buying and selling of agricultural goods and products, this can provide a basis for credit applications in the formal sector. So thank you very much. I'm enjoying this webinar immensely, and I look forward to hearing the next stage.
Thank you, Sophia. And apologies for clubbing your introduction a few minutes ago. In the interest of time, we'll shift quickly to Jemima. She is the global team leader for CARE's Women in Agricultural program, the Pathways program. This is implemented in 6 countries in Africa and Asia with the goal of increasing poor women smallholder farmers' productivity and empowerment in more equitable agricultural systems. And Jemima, remind me, are you dialing in from Nairobi or Tanzania? I think you're about to shift in between.
Hi, Amol. I think if you just bear with me, I'm going to call Jemima in. I think she's having trouble with the audio from Kenya, so if you could just stand by for a minute. Thank you.
Sure, sure. In the meantime, maybe we could take 1 or 2 of the questions. First question comes from, okay, actually, first question is about, is there any mechanism with the mobile operators to find out the women mobile base so that gender-based services can be marketed and promoted to these bases? And that comes from Rajiv from Handigo. Who wants to take a crack at that? You want to take a crack at this question for us, please?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. I think there are 2 issues here. One is SIM registration. Often SIMs are not registered by gender at all. I mean, you need to provide your name, your address, and so on. I'm talking about prepaid now, of course, which is the main type of subscription that these women have. So we have basically no idea who they are initially. I know that governments are now requiring mobile network operators also to register gender, so I think we can anticipate that we'll have access to more detailed records at some point in the near future. But so far, it's been extremely difficult also for others to get a hold of this kind of information. One suggestion I would have is to use your call centers. I mean, many MNOs, mobile network operators, have excellent call centers where they register transactions. And these transactions are generally registered by gender as well, so that you'll have some sense if it's a man or a woman calling in, and that will be a part of his or her record in the call center. So that's one approach to it. Another issue, which is also sort of thorny, is the fact that SIMs are often purchased by male members of the family and given to their sisters, wives, and so on. So they even though they're registered in his name, they may very well be used entirely by his sister, his mother, and so on. So as of now, we're going to have to live with it until governments put their foot down and require gender registration when someone is purchasing even a prepaid SIM.
Thank you, Per. I think we have Jemima conferenced in. What is Jemima?
Hi, I'll just introduce Jemima. She's on loudspeaker from my phone. So thanks very much, Jemima, and over to you now.
Thank you, and I do apologize for the problems that I seem to be having this afternoon with the sound. I'm informed that something to do with the nature of our internet connection here at the office. So I'll be talking about two main things this morning, this afternoon, in Nairobi. One, taking a very broad perspective around increasing access to agricultural services by women that have some relevance to mobile services as well. So looking at the if you could go to the next slide. Looking at the common sources of information by women, and then going on and talking about marketing services to women, what are some of the things we should consider, and giving some examples. Next slide, please. So where do women get information from? This is data from Ethiopia that shows the most common sources of information for women, looking at multiple sources, extension, the traditional extension system, home visits for extension officers, the agriculture meetings held out of the household, demonstrations, and trainings, as well as informal sources. And what the results show us is that it is much less common for women than it is for men to get information out of the household, either visit demonstration plots or attend convened meetings in which agriculture is being discussed. And from what we've had today, it's to do with mobility in some cases, some of the gender-based constraints, accessing information and services. It could be to do with women's time poverty, and what the results also show is that the gender gap is relatively narrow for receiving extension advice through visits to households. So what this means is the closer the information is to women, the more likely that they're able to access this information. Now, next slide, please. So what should we consider then if we're marketing agricultural services to women, and or if we want to really increase access to agricultural services, including information to women? So four key things. First is the information needs and priorities for women. So now we're balancing both a supply and the demand perspective to information and service delivery. The other thing that we know about rural women is the multiple tasks that they have to deal with on a daily basis, and the multiple demands of their time, the multiple activities they are engaged in, which which leads or necessitates that whatever services that are being delivered to women are integrated. That is not just agriculture information services, but it's information services around health, around education, around agricultural activities, around nutrition. The second key aspect is delivery of information, and Sophia talked a bit about it. How do we deliver services, information and services to women? Based on some of the gender constraints, combining text and voice services, for example, being interactive in a way that women can ask questions, can explain or articulate what their demands for information is, issues of language, and more important, having some discussion and feedback around agricultural services. The third issue is creating demand, and I'll be talking a bit about it later. How do you create demand by women for information, for services by women? Working using participatory approaches to do this, mobilizing through other traditional media that are more accessible to women, such as the radio, and also using group-based approaches. The other final thing I want to say about what to consider is balancing the demand and the supply of information. Sometimes we do tend to think this is what women need, but how do we balance what women or what we want to push out there, what women actually need? So it's sort of a need versus availability type of question, so that we are responding to their needs and we're not responding to what we as service providers might be wanting to provide. Next slide, please. I will now give a couple of examples on marketing services to women, and these examples are basically organized around several aspects. The first one being combining mobile and human networks. And this is in recognition of the role of human network even when we're using other types of services, including mobile services, and taking advantage of the common sources of information as Phil talked about. That informal networks seem to be a very common source of information for women. So how do we combine both mobile and human networks? Two examples that come to mind that are pretty similar is something called the Pilatavia helpline in Bangladesh and the Grameen Foundation in Uganda. That basically uses what are called mobile operators, or in the case of the Grameen Foundation, community knowledge workers, that act as an interface between service providers and women smallholder servers in a way that they are able to directly engage with these community knowledge workers or operator ladies, and sort of have a discussion around what are their information needs, and then they will send the line to the mobile operators, and the information is sent back. And one interesting finding from the Grameen Foundation work in Uganda that's also been a key finding in traditional extension systems is that the female community knowledge workers are more likely to reach female servers than male community knowledge workers. So also saying, how do you get women to be sources of information or to be teachers of information other women? Next slide, please. Second element I want
Hello, I'm sorry, Jemima. The audio quality on my end is quite poor. I wonder if you could speak a bit more into the microphone, and if you could, speak up a little bit louder. Or in the interest of time, maybe we should record this session after the call and send it to our attendees as a separate recording to see. Yeah, I'm seeing that attentive level is dropping quickly, and I think other people are also having problems with audio. So yeah, really to kind of cut things short, but yeah, sometimes these technical problems are beyond our reach. Really appreciate everybody's flexibility. Maybe we might try to answer one or two quick questions, very quick questions. First one being, the question is, what is the constraint to mobile network operators closing the mobile gender gap? Is it a marketing problem, ability to pay, or demand problem? In my opinion, in the webinar today, we address the barriers and the constraints. They aren't unbreakable barriers. So I would say that while the constraints exist, they aren't constraints that can't be worked around given today's technologies and today's knowledge. It's a matter of doing a bit of homework and a bit of research. And I'll ask any of the panelists to, if they want to jump in with a quick answer, you could do it in 30 seconds. Please take yourself off mute, and if you have something to add to that question, please jump in the next, and try to keep it to 30 seconds, and then we'll move to one more question.
Thanks. Can I keep this really short? This is Per. Looking at it from the MNO internal perspective. Sure. Looking at it from the internal perspective of an MNO, show me the numbers. Show me the business case. I think that's what they're looking for. The second point is show me some best practice examples. This is something that's often needed to trigger the creativity of the MNOs. So start collecting best practice and start collecting numbers, developing business cases, and so on. That's it.
Thank you very much, Per. Before we wrap up, I want to recognize Victoria Claus for giving a lot of feedback to the presenters and helping us come up with great content and organizing the webinar. You might have seen that the webinar invitation came from her. So thank you, Victoria. Wrapping up, a few housekeeping items. Yeah, apologies again for the technical difficulties. We're going to get a properly recorded version of Jemima's section to everybody. We will also be following up with the links, the email addresses, and we'd love to take this conversation forward. Keep an eye out for more emails coming out from us for future webinars. Nothing on the calendar right now, but we do have future webinars coming up on monitoring evaluation, business case, gender, other knowledge sharing resources will be released via our Twitter feed and via our newsletter list. We will also be releasing a gender-focused note in the next few weeks based on some of the things we spoke about today and some of the things that we are still learning. So yeah, thank you very much for everybody's patience and for participating today. We hope this information was valuable and useful. We couldn't get to all the questions, so the balance of the questions we'll address by email. And anything else, please feel free to post to us via Twitter or via email. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day, evening. Bye-bye.